right, here is my audience, my lovely wife. All right, I apologize for the change in format of this video. I had an entirely different style of presentation planned out. I had intended performing the entire thing at the station with an audience of my shift members, but due to last minute changes that could not be foreseen, nobody was available due to calls, scheduled training, and something else that had popped up. So my wife so graciously decided to be my audience for me. I know I'm lacking 3 others, but we gotta make do. I didn't intend on using PowerPoint, but since I don't have access to the medic and I don't have access to the life pack that I was planning on using, I have to use this as a substitute. So this is gonna be mainly photographs for my talking points, kind of examples. So I'm gonna go ahead and start my speech now. So, what would you think if I told you that we could analyze a lot about your health simply by how you breathe and the gases that come out? So that is what we're going to talk about today. The 2 questions that I propose, or at least research questions so we can understand something new, is what is end-tidal CO2 capnography and what is its use within emergency medical services? So we're going to talk about what this is, because if you're not familiar with medicine, this may seem kind of like some weird, wacky jargon. And it's actually a very common assessment tool used within the pre-hospital setting as well as in the hospital setting, almost as another baseline vital sign to see how you are doing. So, we're going to first start talking about some real basic human anatomy. We all probably took something in school explaining the basics of human anatomy. We're going to talk a little bit more specifically about gas exchange. So we all know that we breathe in, air flows through our nose, into our mouth, down our trachea, and into our lungs, and it expands. And inside your lungs you have little sacs called alveoli. These little anatomical structures have a very diverse and very thick branch of capillary beds wrapped around each alveoli, and they are extremely small. They are almost about the size of 1 or 2 cells in width. And that is what this is a representation here. So you have your lungs at the top, and down here is your alveoli sac. And what this is, this little vessel here, is the vessel that wraps around that alveolar structure. Gas, such as oxygen, nitrogen, and CO2 are exchanged. Now, what is CO2? So CO2 is carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is a gas that is generated by cells as a waste product during their metabolic process. So any cell, anytime it imbibes sugar and other electrolytes, when it's done using the oxygen and everything that it's received as fuel, it then dumps waste back into the blood, being CO2 being one of the elements that we see. The blood is brought back to the lungs, and due to osmotic pressure, which means the pressure of differentiating gases, CO2 will leave the vasculature into the alveolar sac while oxygen goes in. This CO2, as it leaves the blood vessel, is expelled out of your throat, out of your trachea and through your mouth. So we know that the air itself that we breathe is roughly about 21% oxygen, as well as many other gases. We breathe out about 16% oxygen. We also breathe out right around 20 to 30% carbon dioxide, and it's a little different for every person. Carbon dioxide is a very specific gas because of how much we exhale. We lose about 30% through our exhalation, and the reason why it's important is because gas, or that gas particular, has a more acidotic nature. Now, our body lives in harmony, essentially. It likes to live in what we call homeostasis. That is a metabolic state that is conducive for life from the cellular level up to an organism level. The body does not like when there is a change in that balance. So here we have pH. We live at a balance of 7.35 to 7.45. That is our metabolic balance. Any deviation from that below 7.35, which is more acidotic because the numbers are getting smaller, or anything beyond that, which is called alkalotic, can create a metabolic imbalance in the body, and things don't tend to work right. And there is a large cascade that happens across all systems, but we're just focusing on the respiratory system right now. So, anytime we have too much CO2 inside of our body, we start to build or gravitate towards the acidotic side of the scale because CO2 is an acid. And if we breathe off, say we hyperventilate, and we lose too much carbon dioxide, then we'll start sliding on the scale more towards the alkalotic state. So your respiratory cycle is extremely important, not just to bring oxygen in, but to get rid of the bad stuff that could change this pH imbalance. We're going to talk about some devices for measurement next. And these are the common devices that we use pre-hospitally. There are some other things that they will use within the hospital to kind of look at these gas levels, but we're just talking about what we use in the field. So this is the first and probably the most common one we use. This is called a nasal cannula, and the end-tidal CO2 portion is captured by this little spoon, and I'm going to have a picture that displays that. This green top is what connects to our oxygen, and this orange cap is what connects to our LifePak cardiac monitor. When it's placed on the patient, this is how it's sitting on the face, and that spoon has a slight vacuum to it. The machine is pulling a vacuum through this tube, and it's sampling the CO2 in the air just like a gas meter would. Another device that we will use for advanced airways is an endotracheal tube adapter. It's going to measure the gas the same way. There's going to be a slight vacuum on this hose on the way out. It's going to pull gas through the line. This just gets rid of condensation in that line before it gets to the machine, and it will tube sample. In a practical application, this is how it would look. The patient would be intubated, and this is not a real intubated patient. They're just biting on a tube. But the end-tidal CO2 ETT, or endotracheal tube adapter, is right here in the middle, and that line is what's pulling that gas away from the tube to be analyzed. And then this is just what our machine looks like. This is the actual unit that we have on all of our apparatus, and it would plug in right where he is plugging in. Of course, he's blocking it, but that is the port we would use. And this is the information you will see. You have your heart rhythm, you have your oxygen, but right here at the very, very bottom is the waveform that we see to measure end-tidal CO2. The last device that we will use, which we don't really use much anymore, but it's kind of a, if you're in a pinch or if you're in a bind, this is what's called a colorimetric end-tidal CO2. And all it is a color-changing chemical reactive paper that is inside this little plastic housing. If it is purple, it means that it is high CO2 or acidotic, and if it starts to become yellow, then we're in more of a proper pH balance. In our field, we used to say that purple poo, because that's bad. We don't want to have purple on the paper. So, what is capnography? You know, we've been talking about this gas exchange. We've talked about what CO2 is, and we've talked about how we measure it, but what is the point? What is the point of this measurement? So capnography is just that. It's a graph. It is a graph to give us a visual representation of the capno, or the end-tidal CO2. The number that you would get is called capnometry, and if you take that number and you put it into a graph or a waveform, sometimes called a pleth, then that is called capnography. The point of capnography as a visual representation lets us visualize how the body is expelling that air. So I'm going to show a picture of pretty much a perfectly normal capnography waveform. Now, I understand that this is probably alien to a lot of people, but I want to explain this in a very simple way, okay? I want you to pretend that you have a patient laying on their back and their mouth is pointed up. When they breathe out, it blows the air up, and then it kind of steady as they're breathing out, and you're hitting a peak, and then as they breathe in, the air falls back down. So this is the patient breathing out, it kind of steady as they, and as they breathe in, it drops back down. So this bottom line is what we call our inspiratory baseline. It's there's no gas moving because you're currently creating a vacuum because you are breathing in. And this number, this 0, 10, 20, 30, 40, as you can see it says 43 there on the monitor, that is our increments in 10 of how much end-tidal CO2 is being expelled. And that's measured in millimeters of mercury. But as the patient breathes out and they plateau, you'll see they peak right at the end of expiration because you're getting the last bit of those gases out the bottom of your lungs, and it's measuring that highest point. So this waveform is perfectly normal. Well, if we have a problem with this waveform, anywhere in this expiratory phase, during this plateau phase, or during this inspiratory phase, we can quickly visualize what the patient is doing. The number helps us tell if things are being productive in the body. The waveform tells us if there's a mechanical problem with removing that gas, such as this picture. This is our end-tidal CO2 capnography, and it does not look like that previous graph. All the waveforms are pretty much polymorphic. They're not similar at all. It's all over the place, and they have extremely low end-tidal. Now this picture is probably because the measuring device may not be in place properly, but this is probably indicative of the patient breathing really, really fast, which looks like they're breathing about 25 times a minute because this is every breath. So they're breathing off a lot of that gas. So how do we use this capnography in the field? Based on the shape of the waveform, or what we call pleth variations, we can kind of figure out what's going on mechanically. Is the patient not able to get all the air out? Now there are many different graphs here, but the only one I really want to talk about is this one right here, because this is a very common one. We call it the shark fin pleth, or the shark fin waveform. It is indicative of bronchospasms or asthmatic patients. So earlier in that waveform, it would spike straight up because you would breathe out with ease, you would plateau, and then you would breathe in pretty quickly. But this waveform is really, really slow, and what that means is the patient is having trouble getting that air out. So instead of it being a quick, it's more of a, it takes a longer time to get that air out. If you have asthma, it means because your airway is kind of constricting. And as that airway starts to constrict, we get gases trapped in that airway. So this is a sign of gas trapping or bronchospasms. Other things it can show us is if they are breathing too fast or if they're breathing too slow. If the gas starts to increase because they're breathing too slow, then sometimes we have to help them. Sometimes if the gas is going down because they're breathing too fast, we have to try to coach our patient, or we may have to override them or put them to sleep and take over their ventilation for them. Other things that this stuff can tell us is like if a patient is on a mechanical ventilator, we can see, as in this particular waveform, there are little notches on top of the waves. That tells us the patient is attempting to take small breaths in over top the ventilator. It's trying to override. So the patient might either need more sedation or perhaps they're coming out of sedation as intended. So capnography can tell us a lot about the mechanics of breathing. The number itself, though, will tell us if they are in a good metabolic state. Are they getting rid of the gases? Are the cells working the way they're supposed to? Are they processing their energy and getting rid of the bad stuff and taking in the good stuff as intended? Another very popular thing we use in the field is to determine whether or not we have a good positive endotracheal intubation. So if we have to put a breathing tube down someone's throat, you would think it'd be pretty easy. You see, it looks pretty easy in the movies, but in real life, trying to get an endotracheal intubation can be pretty stressful, and it's very, very small airway, very hard to see. There could be secretions, so it's very important we get it right. We like to think we get it right, but sometimes mistakes happen. We can put them on this machine, and as we breathe through that tube, if I am not getting these good squared off changes in the waveform, I can tell that I am most likely in the esophagus as opposed to being in the trachea. So in our field, it is 99% used for endotracheal tube confirmation to make sure we're in the right spot. And the last one that we in the hospital use it for is to verify if we are doing good chest compressions during a cardiopulmonary resuscitation effort. So if we have to perform CPR on somebody, we need to know if what we're doing is working. If we're doing good compressions, which means we're pushing through all that tissue and compressing that heart and getting blood going, then it's still going to cause some kind of metabolic change at your hands, at your end organs. And if we're not doing good enough compressions, we won't see very many changes in that capnography waveform. If we start seeing really good changes, then that kind of tells us that the body is responding to it. And the very last is used in the hospitals. This is just a lot of numbers and a lot of gibberish, but hospitals use what's called arterial blood gas analysis to just make sure that the body and the cells and every portion of the body are responding appropriately, are exchanging gases appropriately. So that is just a brief synopsis of end-tidal CO2 capnography and capnometry and how it's used in the pre-hospital field. I really appreciate your time, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. How long is that?
That was 15 minutes, 45 seconds.